Welcome, restless souls, to Carmen's Crypt. I'm Carmen Carrion, keeper of forgotten tales and curator of nightmares. You've wandered into my domain, where each week I unearth a fresh horror from the depths of human imagination. In these darkened halls, stories wait like hungry shadows. Each tale we've collected whispers of terrors both ancient and new. From crumbling mansions where something skitters behind the walls, to that strange text message you received at 3 a.m. from a number that shouldn't exist. So gather close. The candles are lit, the shadows grow long, and the witching hour is upon us. Are you prepared to face what lurks in the darkest recesses of Carmen's Crypt? Lock your doors, still your nerves, and remember, here, every fear comes alive. This is Carmen's Crypt. Your sanctuary of scares awaits. Mike Sullivan's hands trembled as he packed his gear, the divorce papers still sitting unsigned on his kitchen counter. At 42, hunting season used to be his escape. Now it might be his last chance at normal. His grandfather's Remington felt too heavy as he loaded it into his truck. Ray Cooper's military career ended in Afghanistan after watching his unit get torn apart by an IED. 6 months later, his wife's cancer took what was left of his world. The nightmares kept him awake most nights, but at least his hands stayed steady when he cleaned his rifle. Dave Mitchell's guide service had been his life for 20 years. 3 weeks ago, while marking trails for the upcoming season, he had spotted vultures circling and found the first carcass. It was a buck in a small clearing, turned inside out, its organs arranged like macabre party decorations around the tree line. But something else was terribly wrong. Its eyes had been removed with surgical precision, and its mouth had been peeled open, jaws dislocated to reveal new growth inside. Rows of pulsing, fungal-like growth sprouting from the soft palate like pale fingers reaching for air. 2 days later, he found 3 more deer lying in a triangle, just feet away from each other. Their bodies had been turned inside out, steam still rising from exposed organs despite the freezing temperature. Each carcass showed signs of being inhabited. Tunnels burrowed through muscle tissue, lined with a sickly yellowish membrane that seemed to pulse with its own life. The rangers blamed bears, but Dave had been hunting these woods for 20 years. He knew bear signs. This was something else. Dave had seen old Harris's truck parked by the south trailhead that morning, a beat-up Ford with a faded "I Love Hunting" bumper sticker. They had been rivals in business, guiding hunts since their youth. Harris had always claimed to know these woods better than anyone, often bragging about secret hunting spots he'd never share. Dave wondered if he had finally found one of those spots. The morning fog clung to the ground as Dave followed the fresh tracks toward Miller's Ridge. The silence bothered him most. No birdsong, no squirrels chattering in the trees. Even the wind seemed to die away, leaving only the crunch of his boots on frozen ground. The air carried a strange odor, like mushrooms growing on rotting meat. He almost missed the first sign something was wrong. A splash of red against white snow, partially obscured by fallen leaves. Dave brushed them aside to reveal Harris's prized hunting knife, its blade clean to a mirror shine, but its handle sticky with what looked like pus-filled blisters. The same yellowish growth he'd seen in the deer carcasses were creeping along the leather grip. The tracks led him to a small clearing where they suddenly multiplied. Deer prints everywhere, overlapping and churning the soil. Dave's breath caught in his throat. Through the fog, he could make out several deer standing unnaturally still. But these weren't normal deer. Their fur had fallen away in patches, revealing skin stretched too tight over wrongly shaped bones. Thin yellow tendrils, like fungal roots, wrapped around their legs and connected them to each other through the soil. As Dave approached, they turned as one. Their eyes, once gentle and brown, now held a disturbing gleam, a faint yellow glow, that seemed to pulse beneath clouded corneas. He could have sworn he saw intelligence in those eyes. Not deer intelligence, but something else looking out through stolen bodies. In the center of the group of deer, Harris was on his hands and knees, body convulsing as yellow tendrils erupted from his back, connecting him to the infected deer around him. His jacket hung in tatters, revealing skin that pulsed and rippled as something moved beneath it. All around him, the ground was alive with fungal growth, spreading outward like a web. His chest still moved, but the rhythm was wrong, like multiple hearts beating out of sync. His rifle lay beside him, twisted into a pretzel, as if it were made of warm taffy instead of steel. Harris's eyes snapped open, and Dave stumbled backward. The irises had already begun to cloud over with that sickly yellow glow. His mouth opened, jaw distending far beyond what should have been possible, and Dave caught a glimpse of something writhing in his throat, pale tendrils reaching for air. Dave knew, with chilling certainty, that if he stayed any longer, he would share Harris's fate, becoming another vessel for whatever horror was spreading through these woods. Those pale tendrils would burrow into his flesh, remake him from the inside out, until nothing human remained. He turned and ran. Dave didn't tell anyone what he had seen at first. He started drinking heavily, trying to forget that day. But the nightmares wouldn't leave him alone, and neither would the guilt. By the time he finally went to the Rangers, his report sounded like the ramblings of a madman. Eyes glowing, deer circling like some kind of ritual. Harris's body twisted up like that? Ranger Kirkland shook his head, dismissing him with a sympathetic pat on the shoulder. Sounds like you've been watching too many horror flicks, Dave. Probably a bear, maybe coyotes. You think I don't know what a damn coyote kill looks like? Dave's voice cracked. I'm telling you, this was something different. The Rangers, reluctantly humoring him, sent a small team to the site. When they arrived, the body was gone. Harris's truck still sat at the trailhead, but the clearing Dave described showed no sign of the gruesome scene. Only disturbed snow and faint traces of blood. Maybe scavengers got it, one ranger offered, though the explanation felt hollow. The deer tracks, however, were still there, forming a perfect circle that left the team uneasy. Still, no one took him seriously, not even the hunters who had trusted him for decades. Bills needed paying, and he had 3 hunters booked for opening day. He told himself the whiskey would keep the memories at bay. He was wrong. A week later, as he prepared for the upcoming trip, the memory of Harris's body and the strange circle of deer haunted his every waking moment. Despite his best efforts to convince himself otherwise, he knew something unnatural was stalking the woods. Dave's truck crawled along the logging road, headlights catching glimpses of movement in the tree line. Mike's breath caught as twin reflections flashed yellow in the darkness, too high up for a normal deer, at least 9 feet off the ground. Ray leaned forward from the back seat, hand instinctively reaching for the rifle between his knees. "Did you see that?" Mike asked, voice tight. "Yeah," Dave muttered, gripping the steering wheel harder. "Keep your eyes open, and don't wander off alone while we're out here." Nobody asked why. "Something's spooking the deer this season," David said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Haven't seen normal movement patterns in weeks." He didn't mention the mutated-looking Harris, or the circle of glowing-eyed deer. His hands trembled as he downshifted around a sharp bend. The CB radio crackled to life unprompted. Through bursts of static, they heard what sounded like hooves on wooden floors, followed by wet, tearing sounds and something that might have been screaming. Dave snapped it off, but not before Mike caught fragments of words hidden in the static. Help and hungry. and run. "Power interference," Dave muttered. "Gets weird up here." The cabin appeared through the trees, looking somehow wrong in the gathering dusk. The windows were dark holes, and Mike could have sworn he saw something move behind the glass, something too tall and angular to be human. As they unloaded their gear, a sound split the darkness, start of a normal deer call that twisted into a wet, gurgling screech. Dave dropped his bag, mumbling about checking the generator. His flashlight beam shook as he rounded the cabin. The beam caught something red and wet dripping from the generator's housing. When he touched it, it was warm and sticky, fresh blood, but riddled with what looked like yellowish pustules and throbbing veins. He didn't tell the others. Inside, they went through the motions of a normal hunting camp evening. They cleaned their guns and passed a bottle of bourbon, Mike and Ray oblivious to Dave's growing unease. Around midnight, Mike saw it first. A massive buck standing at the edge of the cabin's light. Its head was cocked at an impossible angle, neck twisted nearly backwards. As he watched, frozen, its mouth began to open, splitting its face vertically like a blooming flower. Row after row of writhing fungal tendrils emerged, dripping with the same infected blood Dave had found on the generator. Morning brought heavy fog and the sharp copper stench of blood. They found the first body 50 yards from the cabin. A coyote splayed open from throat to tail, its ribcage pulled apart like wooden gates. Inside, where organs should have been, they found a pulsing mass of infected tissue, threaded through with yellowish veins that seemed to move of their own accord. Fresh deer tracks led away from the corpse, but they seemed wrong, too deep, as if whatever made them had been impossibly heavy. "We should go," Ray said, his voice cracking. "Something's wrong here." But Dave was already walking deeper into the fog, following tracks that led deeper into the forest. He knew what waited in these woods, had known since finding that first mutilated buck 3 weeks ago. The only question was whether they'd survive long enough to understand why the deer had changed, why they had started hunting other animals and humans. Dave's footsteps crunched through the fog-laden forest, the sound somehow wrong, too hollow, as if the ground beneath was riddled with cavities. Ray and Mike followed reluctantly, rifles ready, though both men knew something was terribly wrong in these woods. The tracks led them to a clearing where the fog seemed to pull like mercury. The air grew thick with a sickly sweet smell, rot mixed with something metallic, like copper pennies left too long in the sun. Mike gagged, but Ray recognized the scent from Afghanistan. It was the smell of fresh viscera, exposed to open air. "Dave!" Ray called out, voice barely above a whisper. "We need to turn back." But Dave had stopped dead at the clearing's edge. His flashlight beam caught movement. Dozens of deer standing in formation, their bodies wrong in ways that defied explanation. Their limbs had elongated, joints bending backward at impossible angles. Pulsing growths burst through their hides like cancerous tumors, yellow veins spiderwebbing across exposed muscle. Their faces were twisted, jaws distended to reveal endless rows of writhing fungal tendrils that glowed with a sickly inner light. At the center of the formation stood something that had once been a buck. Its massive body towered 12 feet high, muscle and sinew wrapped around a framework of infected tissue that had completely replaced its skeleton. Its antlers had grown wild and twisted, dripping with a yellowish ichor that sizzled when it hit the frozen ground. Mike's nerve broke. He turned to run, and that's when the rest of the herd emerged from the fog behind them. The creatures that had once been deer moved with terrible speed, their infected limbs leaving deep gouges in the frozen earth. Mike managed one shot before they reached him. The rifle's report echoed through the trees, followed by a wet, tearing sound, and Mike's scream, cut suddenly short. Ray grabbed Dave's arm and yanked him toward a fallen log as arterial spray painted the fog red. "Move!" he shouted, military training taking over. But Dave stood transfixed, watching as Mike's body was torn apart by the frenzied creatures. Their fungal tendrils ripped through flesh and bone with horrifying efficiency. The massive buck reared up, hooves the size of dinner plates cratering the earth. Its roar was like nothing natural, a sound that made Dave's teeth vibrate and his vision blur. Ray's rifle barked 3 times, the shots punching chunks of infected meat from the monster's hide. But the wounds seemed to have little effect, yellowish pus oozing from holes that were already starting to seal. "Run!" Ray whispered, shoving Dave hard. This time, Dave's legs obeyed. They crashed through the underbrush as inhuman screams echoed behind them. The sound of pursuit was everywhere, cracking branches, pounding hooves, and that terrible wet squelching of infected flesh. They had almost reached the cabin when Ray's foot caught a root. He went down hard, rifle clattering away into the fog. Dave skidded to a stop, turned back, and saw them. Dozens of glowing eyes in the mist, moving fast. The creatures had herded them here deliberately. The massive buck burst from the fog, its infected body somehow even larger than before. Ray scrambled to his feet, but it was too late. The monster's antlers caught him mid-rise, impaling him through the chest and lifting him into the air. Ray's scream turned to a wet gurgle as the creature shook its head violently, tearing him apart. Dave ran. Behind him, he could hear the herd pursuing, their infected hooves squelching against stone and frozen earth. The cabin was just ahead, but he knew now that walls wouldn't save him. Nothing would save him. These woods belonged to something else now, something that had hollowed out the local deer and turned them into monsters. As he sprinted through the darkness, Dave's mind returned to those first mutilated carcasses he had found. He understood now that they hadn't been kills. They had been metamorphoses. Something had infected the deer, transformed them from the inside out. And now they were hungry, and not for their usual diet of berries and acorns. Now they hunted flesh, human flesh. Dave's boots pounded against frozen earth as he ran, each impact sending shock waves of pain through his exhausted legs. The cabin loomed ahead, a dark rectangle against the starlit sky. He could hear them behind him, the wet squelching of infected hooves, the rattling breath through malformed throats, the sound of branches snapping under the weight of things that used to be deer. The cabin door hung open, swaying slightly in the cold wind. Dave dove through it, slamming it shut behind him and throwing the bolt. His hands shook as he dragged a heavy oak table across the floor, bracing it against the door. Outside, something massive slammed against the cabin wall, making the whole structure shudder. In the dim light filtering through dirty windows, Dave saw one of Ray's rifles lying where he'd left it on the coffee table. He grabbed it, checking the magazine with trembling fingers. 3 rounds left. Better than nothing. A twisted antler punched through the wall beside him, dripping with yellowish pus and trailing infected tissue. Dave stumbled backward, firing twice at the pulsing mass visible through the hole. The shots tore through diseased flesh, doing little more than annoying the creature. It withdrew with a wet, sucking sound, leaving behind a hole that leaked frozen air and the stench of rot. Dave's back hit the kitchen counter. His hand found the satellite phone he'd left there earlier, his last hope for survival. He punched in 911 as another impact rocked the cabin. The phone crackled with static, then went dead. Through its speaker, he heard what sounded like hoofbeats, followed by that wet squelching sound that would haunt his nightmares if he survived this night. The windows exploded inward simultaneously, showering the room with broken glass. Dave caught glimpses of twisted forms flowing through the openings. Too many limbs, too many angles, infected tissue pulsing with sickly yellow. He fired his last round at the nearest shape and ran for the stairs to the basement. The basement door slammed behind him as he thundered down rotting wooden steps. His flashlight beam caught shelves of canned goods, old hunting gear, and there, a gun safe in the corner. If he could reach it, he might have a chance. The combination was simple. His daughter's birthday. His fingers had just touched the dial when he heard it. That wet, squelching sound coming from the dark corner behind him. Dave turned, flashlight beam cutting through basement shadows. The beam caught movement in the coal chute, a twisted mass of infected flesh forcing its way through an opening barely big enough for a child. As he watched, frozen in horror, the thing's body compressed and flowed like liquid nightmare, yellow pustules bursting as it squeezed through. He abandoned the gun safe and ran for the storm doors leading outside. They were stuck fast, swollen with age and winter moisture. Dave threw his shoulder against them once, twice, hearing the wood creak. Behind him, the thing finished squeezing through the coal chute. His flashlight beam caught it unfolding, limbs snapping back into place, infected tissue pulsing with a ghastly glow. That's when he recognized it, the creature that used to be Harris. The storm doors finally burst open under Dave's third desperate impact. He scrambled through them into the night air, feeling something sharp graze his leg as the basement creature lunged. Blood ran hot down his calf, but adrenaline kept him moving. The woods waited ahead, dark and dense. He knew the deer would be out there, hunting, but staying here meant certain death. Dave plunged into the forest, using decades of hunting experience to navigate by moonlight. His injured leg left a trail of blood. He could hear the creatures sniffing it out behind him. The massive buck's roar echoed through the trees. Closer now. Too close. A fallen tree provided temporary cover. Dave pressed himself against the rotting trunk, trying to control his ragged breathing. Through gaps in the bark, he watched 3 of the creatures stalk past. Their infections had spread further, yellowish veins and pulsing growths bursting through meat and muscle. One turned its head completely backward, jaw unhinging to taste the air with a tongue that writhed like dying worms. The hunting cabin's generator exploded behind him, a sudden flash that illuminated the forest in stark relief. In that moment of harsh light, Dave saw them all, dozens of twisted forms moving through the trees, herding him towards something ahead. Through the branches, he caught glimpses of Miller's Ridge. The same ridge where he had found that circle of deer 3 weeks ago. That same ridge where he saw Harris transforming. Dave turned to run in another direction, but his injured leg buckled. He went down hard, teeth cracking against frozen earth. Before he could rise, something grabbed his ankle. He looked back to see infected tissue erupting from the ground itself, yellowish veins spreading through the soil like corrupt roots. The massive buck emerged from the darkness, its diseased body towering over him. Dave screamed as it lowered its twisted head, rows of writhing fungal tendrils dripping yellow ichor. The last thing he saw was his own reflection, distorted in its clouded, glowing eyes, as the creature's jaw began to open. Dave's world exploded into pain as the infected deer's mouth engulfed his shoulder. But instead of tearing flesh, he felt something worse, a burning sensation as thousands of microscopic filaments pushed into his skin. The massive buck wasn't trying to eat him, it was trying to infect him. Through the haze of agony, Dave's hand found a sharp rock. With the last of his strength, he drove it into the creature's eye. The beast reared back, releasing him with a wet, squelching sound. Yellow ichor sprayed from the wound, splattering across Dave's face and chest. Each droplet felt like acid, sending tendrils of fire through his veins. Somehow, he managed to stumble to his feet. The infection was already spreading. He could feel it crawling through his shoulder, replacing muscle and bone with something alien and wrong. His vision began to shift, colors inverting, the darkness of the forest suddenly alive with pulsing, bioluminescent patterns he'd never noticed before. The other deer had formed a circle around him, but they weren't attacking. They were waiting, watching. Dave realized with horror that he could feel their presence in his mind now, a hive mind of corrupt thoughts and alien hunger. Through their shared consciousness, he began to understand. The infection hadn't started with the deer. They were just vessels, host for something that had slumbered deep beneath Miller's Ridge for centuries. The recent logging operations had disturbed its resting place, a vast underground network of fungal growth that had waited patiently for a chance to spread. The deer had been first because they were plentiful, easy to infect, but they were just the beginning. Through their shared vision, Dave saw the infection's plan, how it would use the deer to spread through hunting season, infecting hunters who would return to their homes and families, carrying the spores to cities and towns across the country. Fighting against the growing connection, Dave fumbled for his pocket. His fingers, already beginning to elongate and twist, closed around his lighter. The infection had spread through his entire left side now, yellow veins pulsing beneath his skin. He could feel his jaw starting to distend, new growths pushing up through his soft palate. But he still had control of his right hand, the hand holding the lighter. "You want to spread?" he growled, voice distorting as his vocal cords transformed. "Try spreading through ashes." Dave flicked the lighter and touched it to his jacket, still soaked in generator fuel from his earlier encounter. Flames exploded across his body. The hive mind screamed in his thoughts, not in pain, but in frustration, as it realized its carefully laid plan was about to be disrupted. The infected deer charged forward, trying to stop him, but Dave was already burning too hot to touch. He ran straight for the massive buck, tackling it with his burning body. The creature's infected flesh caught fire instantly, yellow ichor acting like accelerant. The flames spread through the herd like wildfire, following the network of infected tissue that connected them all. Dave felt a moment of triumph before the pain overwhelmed him. As consciousness faded, he saw the forest catching fire, burning away the infection's groundwork. His last thought was of his daughter, how she would never know that her birthday, the combination to that gun safe he never reached, had given him the strength for this final act. 3 days later, after the forest fire had been contained, Ranger Kirkland led a team through the burned area. They found a massive circle of deer carcasses, charred beyond recognition. At the center lay 2 bodies fused together, one human, one barely recognizable as a deer. Both had been burned down to ash, but as they turned to leave, one ranger noticed something in the ashes. Tiny yellow spores, barely visible, drifting on the wind. And deep beneath the scorched earth of Miller's Ridge, in caves untouched by the fire, something ancient stirred and began to grow again, waiting for its next opportunity to emerge. And so, dear listeners, we emerge from another dark corner of Carmen's crypt. But remember, the horrors you've heard tonight are merely echoes of the terrors that await in the shadows of your own mind. If you enjoyed your stay in the crypt, why not invite a friend to join us next week? After all, fear is best when shared. Leave a review if you dare, or share your own tales of terror on my social media. Who knows, your nightmares might just become my next story. Until next time, keep checking under your bed. And remember, in Carmen's crypt, every fear comes alive, and no one is truly safe. Sweet dreams. if you can still sleep at all.